So, Michael, thank you very much for joining Energy Live News. Today is the fifth day after Russia forces entered Ukraine, and we see that delegations from the two countries have begun talks aimed at the end of this war. What does this Russian invasion mean for international markets, energy markets, and specifically the UK's energy market?
Well, I think it's just been a huge shock to everyone. I mean, I think most people didn't think it would be a all-out invasion. And I guess we're still sort of holding our breath and trying to think about what happens next in terms of energy supplies. We've seen a whole host of sanctions, but we've stopped short of targeting the flow of oil and gas into the European market and onto the international markets, because I think it's well understood that that would do a lot of economic damage to the West. The energy markets have responded. We're already jittery last week, but we've seen the oil price going up over $100 a barrel. And in the UK and in Europe, the gas price has spiked, but it's not gone back to the levels that it was a few weeks ago. And of course, one of the things we need to understand is that this is happening against the backdrop of a really tight global market, both for oil and gas, which means that there is no easy way of finding alternative sources of supply. And so the first response, obviously, is to price the conflict into the cost of oil and gas, but then to start to think, well, what happens if? And of course, I guess in Europe, minds are focused on what happens if gas deliveries from Russia were stopped. They're already lower than would normally be the case because of the actions of Gazprom earlier in the year. So I think everyone's sort of holding their breath, holding their nerve.
We have seen the UK government last week saying that the UK is not so much dependent on the Russian gas, and we are actually in a rather good state. How do you think that the Russia's assault on Ukraine will affect the UK gas supplies?
Well, it is true that physically we don't get a lot of Russian gas. It's probably about 4% of total consumption. Some of it is as LNG from Novatek coming into our LNG terminals, and a smaller amount is as pipeline gas through our interconnectors with Belgium and the Netherlands. But it's well understood that even though we're not part of the European Union single energy market, we're part of a European gas market, and that our gas prices have to compete with European hub prices. So, for example, our own national balancing point price tends to follow the TTF price in the Netherlands. So that I think it's understood that there's a physical and there's a price shock exposure. The other problem I guess we have is that we don't have a lot of strategic storage. So we kind of operate on a pay-as-you-go version in terms of supplies of natural gas, with pipeline gas from the UK's North Sea and Norway being the largest part of our supply, and the bulk of the rest being made up by LNG, which we have to compete for in international markets. Since Christmas, when the price signals changed and were very high, a lot of LNG has come to the UK and elsewhere in Europe. So it's come into the UK from the United States. So there are a large number of deliveries in January and February. In actual fact, gas has flowed through the pipeline system into Europe because we've been well supplied and we don't have lots of strategic storage to fill up. Our storage is essentially the line pack that exists in the pipeline system and a modest amount of short-term storage. So if there was a physical reduction in supply, it would start to get a bit difficult.
You just mentioned a price exposure. A recent report suggests that energy bills for UK households could reach £3,000 a year by October. What's your take on that?
Well, I just got my energy bill, and unfortunately, my long-term deal ran out last week. So already we've seen the Ofgem cap has gone up, to around about £2,000 a household, and it's a 6-monthly review. So much will depend on what happens with the gas price between now and the autumn. Normally the summer is a period of relatively low gas demand and low price, but because storage in Europe is low, there's going to be a need to refill that storage, which probably means higher prices than normal. And that was the case even before we had Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So I guess all bets are off. But if it turns out to be the case that over the coming 6 months, gas prices are significantly higher, then the price cap will have to go up to reflect that. So again, it's part of a knock-on effect from a global shortage of supply, which has been multiplied by geopolitical tensions in Europe.
Other analysts say that probably many more energy suppliers here in the UK will go under as a result of the escalation of the crisis. Do you agree with that?
Not an expert on the retail market, but I think we did have a system, and even the regulator now admits that the barriers to entry were not sufficiently high, that we have a number of small companies which with relatively weak financials, now 30 of them already gone out of business. We used to have a reliance on 6. Whether we'll go back to a smaller number, I don't know. But the problem there, of course, is that they've made promises to their customers to deliver gas and electricity at prices which are much, much lower than they can currently source that energy. And the longer it goes on, the bigger their debts become. So it's quite possible.
From your experience, how vulnerable is Europe's gas supply system right now?
Well, if you think back to previous problems with Russia and Ukraine and the transit of gas through Russia and Ukraine, there was various stress tests done at the time as to what Europe could withstand. I think we had an analysis done in the UK a few years ago when our large storage facility Rough was decommissioned, looking at potential scenarios, and they looked at 2 scenarios. One was the disruption of pipeline gas supply from Russia, and the other was something that disrupted LNG supply. And the consultants at the time said, well, we won't get both at the same time. That's exactly what we face. We have a very tight LNG market. It's very difficult to suddenly magic up new LNG supplies to compensate for potential shortfall. So yes, we're very exposed, but we're getting towards the end of the winter heating season. And I've seen reports that German experts are saying that they think there's probably enough gas in storage, that we could get away with it, but it depends on what happens with the weather. So we might be able to weather a short-term disruption of supply. I think the harder questions come in terms of our longer-term energy relationship with Russia. Trying to replace 30 to 40% of gas supply is going to be very, very difficult, if not impossible.
Just yesterday, last night, BP announced will offload its stake in Russian oil and gas firm. What impact do you think that this international embargo will have on Russian energy sector?
Well, the thing to understand here is that the Russian energy sector has been under significant sanctions since 2014. There have been quite heavy sanctions, particularly on oil projects. And in 2014, a number of international companies exited large projects. ExxonMobil exited its relationship with Rosneft in the Kara Sea. BP's ownership of Rosneft is a legacy from TNK-BP. It's been, as we say, a nice little earner for BP. But BP doesn't actually have much influence, if any, over what Rosneft does. And actually, in the context of BP's desire to become a low carbon energy company, owning 20% of Rosneft's emissions is actually a liability. I think so. I think the problem really is, having to offload this large shareholding under duress. It's a kind of fire sale prices. They're not necessarily going to realize its real value. And it comes at a difficult time for the company. It's trying to finance its transformation into an energy company. So never a good time to have to do this. But I think certainly that the leadership of BP understand that this having a 20% share in this particular company is not tenable.
Just my final question, Michael, for you is how optimistic you are for the future of this crisis and the energy market. I mean, even the UK's energy market and the international energy market. Do you feel that they will manage to handle these gas price hikes that have been observed?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to be optimistic. I'm old enough to remember the 1970s energy crisis when I was at school and the lights went out and we had a 3-day week. It's not the first time there have been major shocks to the global energy system, and thereafterwards we react. I think the complicating issue perhaps here is it is also against a backdrop of understanding the challenge of climate change. And today, the IPCC's published a report just telling us how significant that problem is. I'm hopeful that the one thing we don't do is decide that we've got to develop lots more fossil fuels to replace Russia's fossil fuels, that maybe we can use a tragic situation to accelerate our determination to decarbonize and reduce our dependence on volatile fossil fuels as quickly as we possibly can. That will turn out to be a Pyrrhic victory for Russia as a major hydrocarbon exporter. Short term, obviously, we've got a real problem with physical security of supply and price security of supply to manage. But I'd like to hope that we can find a way of trying to de-escalate the situation. But the problem I feel is I don't see an easy exit strategy for Putin here. now that he's done what he's done. But actually, he's getting the exact opposite to what he wants. He's seeing greater solidarity and cooperation among European allies and between Europe and the United States and Canada. So we must wait and see and hope that the worst, things do not get worse before they get better.